Nathaniel Nate Carter's day had started like any other. It was an early morning in early spring, the sky still pale and streaked with the remnants of night, and the birds chirped as if nothing unusual would happen. He had loaded his mail truck, checked the list of deliveries, and started his usual route down Pinewood Drive. This was the part of town he liked best. Quiet, familiar. The streets weren't lined with expensive mansions or fancy cars, but they were neat and homey. And in a world where so many people barely took the time to notice each other, Nate appreciated that his job allowed him to be part of the rhythm of so many lives. He didn't mind the repetition. In fact, he found a certain peace in it. The streets he drove down, the houses, the small rituals of daily life. There was something soothing about it all. And then there was Lydia Johnson's house. She was an elderly widow who lived alone in a small but charming house at the end of Pinewood. For as long as Nate had been delivering the mail, Lydia had always been outside. Whether it was tending to her flowers or sitting on her porch swing with a book, she was always there, as if rooted to the earth itself. But today something felt wrong. As Nate rounded the corner and pulled up to her house, his eyes immediately caught the overgrown lawn. It was impossible not to notice. The front yard, once an idyllic oasis, was now an unruly mess of weeds and neglected flower beds. The hedges, which had been trimmed with precision only weeks ago, were now wild and unkempt, as if left to fend for themselves. Even the once perfect garden looked like it had been abandoned. This wasn't just a simple case of a forgotten afternoon. This was something more. He pulled his truck to the curb and parked. Stepping out, he scanned the yard. The mailbox, which Lydia always kept spotless, was now overflowing with letters, catalogs, and flyers, some even spilling out onto the ground. His heart skipped a beat. He had seen this before too many times in his life. The first signs of something wrong, something irreversible. Nate had always found comfort in the consistency of his route, the sense that people could be counted on to follow their usual habits. But Lydia was different. He was always out there, always present. And now she wasn't. He knocked on the door, the sound of his knuckles against the wood seeming too loud in the silence. A moment passed, then another, and still no answer. He knocked again, louder this time. "Mrs. Johnson," he called. "It's Nate, the mailman. Are you all right?" No response. The air around him seemed to thicken, as if the whole street was holding its breath. He moved to the window, hoping to catch a glimpse of Lydia inside, but the blinds were drawn tightly, blocking his view. He tried again, once more, a polite knock followed by a call. "Mrs. Johnson? It's Nate. I'm just checking in." Still nothing. A strange, uneasy feeling began to settle deep in his gut. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the street, and the house seemed even darker than it should have been. Normally, the soft glow of lamps would be visible through the windows at this hour. But today nothing. Just darkness. His unease deepened, and his instincts, which he had ignored for so long, began to scream at him. This wasn't right. Nate hesitated, staring at the door. He had delivered mail to this house almost every day for years, and Lydia had always greeted him with a smile. Her kindness was like an anchor in the busy whirlwind of life, a moment of quiet warmth. But today there was nothing. No greeting, no warm smile, no sign of life. He took a deep breath, his mind racing. He'd heard stories about people who had been found days or weeks later, and the guilt of not noticing sooner had haunted those who lived around them. He couldn't let that happen here. Not with Lydia. His mind made up, Nate stepped back and dialed 911. The phone rang for what felt like an eternity before a voice answered. 911, what's your emergency? I'm a mailman. I delivered to Mrs. Lydia Johnson on Pinewood Drive, Nate began, his voice tight. Something's wrong. I've been delivering her mail for years, and I've never seen her yard in this condition. The mailbox is overflowing and I haven't heard from her. I knocked, but no one's answered. The dispatcher's voice turned serious as she asked for details. Nate gave her everything he could, his concern growing with each word he spoke. When he finished, there was a long pause. "Stay where you are, Mr. Carter. We're sending a unit to your location now." Nate's heart pounded in his chest. He could hear the faint sound of sirens in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. The police arrived quickly, 2 squad cars, one following the other, lights flashing. Officers stepped out and approached him with brisk professionalism. "You called about Mrs. Johnson?" one officer asked, a woman with short brown hair. She looked at him with a mix of concern and calm. "Yeah," Nate said, his voice shaky. "I don't know what's going on, but something's wrong. I've never seen her like this." "We'll take it from here," the officer said, making a note in her notebook. "Stay back for now. We'll need to check things out." Nate stepped aside as the officers approached the house. They rang the doorbell and knocked loudly. But still no response. The officers exchanged a quick look, and then one of them moved to the door with a crowbar. With a swift motion, they pried it open. The sound of breaking wood echoed across the quiet street. Inside there was an eerie silence. Nate stood frozen, his breath shallow. The officers entered, and moments later one of them came back out, face pale, as if carrying a weight too heavy to explain. He turned to Nate, his voice tight. "Get a hold of yourself, Mr. Carter. You did the right thing by calling. But you need to prepare yourself." Before Nate could speak, the ambulance arrived and paramedics rushed inside. Nate's stomach dropped. He could feel his hands shaking, but he couldn't tear his eyes away from the house. What had they found in there? The officer's voice broke through his thoughts. "We need to know, when was the last time you saw her?" "About 2 weeks ago," Nate said quickly, his mind racing. "She was fine then. She always sits on her porch or tends her garden. She seemed okay." The officer nodded and scribbled a few more notes. "We'll need to take her to the hospital. We've stabilized her, but she's in critical condition. Something's happened. We'll investigate further." Nate's world tilted on its axis. Lydia? In critical condition? How? She had been perfectly fine the last time he'd seen her. She had smiled at him as usual, waved goodbye. How had it all gone wrong so quickly? As the ambulance doors slammed shut and the sirens wailed, Nate stood there, heart pounding in his chest. His mind raced, 1,000 questions swirling in his head. What had happened to Lydia? Why hadn't anyone checked on her sooner? And most of all, why had she been alone, hidden away in that dark house? Nate climbed into his postal truck and began the slow drive toward the hospital, though his thoughts were miles away. His route, his usual life, felt so distant now. Lydia had always been a fixture of this neighborhood, and now, she was somewhere in critical care, and he didn't know if she'd make it. Nate could hardly believe what had just happened. The drive to Mercy General Hospital felt like an eternity, the world around him a blur of gray and muted colors. He had always been a calm, methodical person, the kind of man who took life one step at a time. But today his mind raced, and every passing minute felt like an eternity. The image of Lydia's dark house, the overgrown lawn, and the police breaking down the door played on a loop in his head. Why hadn't anyone noticed? Why hadn't someone checked on her before it got to this point? The sun was beginning to dip low in the sky as Nate pulled into the hospital parking lot. The fluorescent lights of the hospital seemed too bright, too artificial. The noise of bustling staff, the low murmur of conversations, and the beeping of machines felt like a distant hum to him. His heart hammered in his chest, and his palms were clammy as he stepped out of the truck. He had never been to the hospital under circumstances like these. He had seen his share of routine deliveries and quick hellos, but nothing like this. He made his way through the automatic doors and was immediately hit by the sterile smell of antiseptic. It was overwhelming, sharp and unnatural. The sound of his footsteps echoed on the tile floor as he approached the front desk. The receptionist, a young woman with dark hair tied into a neat bun, looked up at him and offered a polite but distant smile. "Can I help you?" she asked, though her voice lacked warmth, like she had asked the same question 1,000 times before. I'm looking for Mrs. Lydia Johnson. He was just brought in." "She's in critical condition," Nate said, trying to steady his voice, but his words felt thick, like they were getting stuck in his throat. The receptionist's fingers hesitated over the keyboard for a moment, her expression becoming more serious as she typed. Nate stood there, waiting, feeling his anxiety growing with each passing second. "I'm afraid I don't have an update just yet," she said finally, her tone softer than before. "But let me call someone who can help." Nate nodded, unable to speak. He barely noticed the sounds of the hospital around him, the hushed conversations of nurses, the distant beeping of heart monitors. All he could focus on was Lydia. His mind swirled with questions. How had it come to this? She had been fine. He had always been fine. How long had she been alone in that house? How had it gone unnoticed? His thoughts were interrupted by the nurse who came to the desk, her face serious but not unkind. She had short, dark hair and a calm, steady demeanor that immediately put Nate on edge. She was here to deliver news, and Nate could already tell it wouldn't be easy to hear. "Mr. Carter?" the nurse asked, her voice even. He nodded, his breath shallow. "Yes. I need to know what's going on with Mrs. Johnson. Is she all right? Is she going to make it?" The nurse exchanged a brief glance with the receptionist, then turned her attention back to Nate. "I'm afraid Mrs. Johnson is in a very serious condition. She was found in an advanced state of dehydration and malnutrition. Her body is weak and she's showing signs of severe trauma." Nate's heart skipped a beat. "Trauma? What kind of trauma?" "Trauma?" he repeated, barely able to wrap his mind around the words. "What do you mean?" "She wasn't sick. She was just tending to her garden. She seemed fine." The nurse's expression softened, but there was no comforting way to say what she was about to. "There's no sign of immediate external injury. But there are signs of a prolonged absence of care, both physically and emotionally. We're running more tests now, but there's no question she's been severely neglected for some time." Nate felt like he'd been struck in the chest. He could barely catch his breath. Neglected? Lydia had always been independent, a woman who prided herself on maintaining her home and staying active. How could she have been neglected? How could no one have seen it? His mind whirled with questions he couldn't answer. It felt like the ground beneath him had disappeared, like he was standing on air. He gripped the edge of the desk, trying to steady himself. "Can I see her?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The nurse hesitated for a moment, her eyes flickering to the door of the emergency room. "It's not easy to see her right now. She's sedated and we're still stabilizing her. But if you'd like to see her you can, though it's not a pretty sight. She's in critical condition and we don't know what the outcome will be." Nate swallowed hard. He had to see her. He had to know that she wasn't alone in this. He couldn't leave her here in a hospital bed with only strangers around. She had always been there for him, offering a warm smile when he delivered the mail. He owed her this. "I have to see her," Nate said more firmly this time. "Please." The nurse nodded slowly and motioned for him to follow her. They walked down the sterile hallways, the sound of their footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. The further they went, the more Nate's stomach twisted. Every passing door felt like it was leading him deeper into some kind of nightmare. Finally, they reached a small white-walled room. The door creaked as it opened, revealing Lydia in a hospital bed, a tangle of 4 lines and monitors attached to her frail body. Her skin was pale and her once vibrant hair lay limp around her face. The sight of her, so small, so fragile, was almost too much to bear. Nate's chest tightened as he stepped inside, his throat constricting. This wasn't the Lydia he knew. The woman who had always greeted him with a smile, who had tended her flowers with pride, who had spent her days laughing and chatting with the neighbors. She was gone, replaced by this sickly, unrecognizable form. He stood by her bed, watching the rise and fall of her chest as the machines beeped softly. The room was filled with the sterile smell of antiseptic, but the emotional weight of the moment made it hard to breathe. Tears pricked at Nate's eyes, but he fought them back, unwilling to let his emotions overtake him in front of the nurse. He gently reached for her hand, brushing his fingers against her cold skin. It felt like an eternity before he could speak again. "How did this happen?" he whispered, his voice breaking. "How did you end up like this, Lydia? What happened to you?" But there was no answer. Lydia remained motionless, her face peaceful in its sedated stillness. All Nate could do was stand there, his heart heavy with guilt and confusion. Minutes later, the door to the room opened again and another doctor entered. An older man with graying hair and glasses perched on the edge of his nose. He nodded politely at Nate before turning his attention to the machines. "Mr. Carter, I'm Dr. Sullivan," the doctor said. "We're doing everything we can, but as I mentioned earlier, Mrs. Johnson's condition is critical. We've stabilized her for now, but there's a lot we still don't understand." Nate looked at him, trying to steady his breath. "What do you mean? Why didn't anyone notice she was like this? She was fine when I saw her last." Dr. Sullivan sighed, adjusting his glasses. "It's complicated. From the physical evidence, it seems like she's been in this condition for at least a few weeks, if not longer. The emotional neglect, though, may have gone on for much longer. It's difficult to say. She hasn't had anyone checking in on her. No family, no close friends. It's all been very isolated." The words felt like a punch to the gut. Nate had seen Lydia every day. He had delivered her mail, nodded hello, waved goodbye, but he never realized that she was alone, truly alone, in a way he couldn't understand. "The trauma," Dr. Sullivan continued, "appears to have been internal. She's dehydrated, malnourished, and has experienced some psychological strain, likely due to isolation. But it's more than that. We'll need to run further tests, and we may be able to determine more soon." "Isolation," Nate repeated, his mind grappling with the implications. "She was always so kind, so active. How did it get this far?" The doctor shook his head. "Sometimes, people become isolated without others even realizing it. It's a slow process, a gradual thing. And when it happens, the signs are easy to miss, especially in someone who is independent, like Mrs. Johnson." The weight of the doctor's words hung heavily in the air. The guilt swirled in Nate's mind. He had seen the signs, hadn't he? The overgrown yard, the full mailbox. He had noticed, but he had been too caught up in his own life to pay attention. He had assumed she was fine, that nothing had changed. But everything had changed. The next morning, Nate couldn't shake the weight of what he'd witnessed. As he started his route, every stop felt like a hollow routine. When he finally reached Pinewood Drive, the sight of Lydia's house made his stomach churn. The police tape around her property flapped in the breeze, a silent reminder of the chaos that had unfolded. Nate parked his truck a little farther away than usual and stepped out. He wanted to walk the block, let the familiar surroundings soothe him, but every step felt heavier. The street seemed eerily quiet, as if the neighborhood itself was holding its breath. Pinewood Drive was no stranger to gossip, but the chatter of Lydia's fate had not yet reached the usual porch-bound culprits. As Nate approached Lydia's house, he noticed something he hadn't seen the day before. The faint outline of footprints leading away from the side of the house, cutting through the overgrown lawn. They didn't belong to the officers. These were smaller, lighter steps, and they led directly into the back garden. A sense of unease prickled his skin. He looked around, hoping to catch sight of anyone nearby, but the street was deserted. His instincts told him to walk away, but curiosity overpowered caution. He stepped over the police tape and followed the footprints. The garden, once Lydia's pride and joy, looked like a neglected battlefield of weeds and overturned soil. At the far end, where the footprints stopped, was an old greenhouse Nate had never noticed before. Its glass panels were clouded with grime, and ivy had claimed most of its structure. Pushing open the creaky door, Nate stepped inside. The air was damp, carrying a faint, metallic tang. Rows of empty pots and broken tools lined the shelves, but what caught his attention was a wooden chest in the corner, half hidden beneath a tarp. The chest seemed out of place in the otherwise utilitarian space, its ornate carvings far too elegant for a garden shed. Nate hesitated. Every part of him screamed to leave it alone, but he knelt and tugged at the tarp. The chest wasn't locked, and its lid opened with a groan. Inside he found stacks of old photographs, yellowed and curling at the edges. The faces were familiar. Neighbors, townsfolk, even Nate himself delivering mail. The unsettling part was how they were arranged. Each face was meticulously scratched out with thin, jagged lines. At the very top of the pile was a photograph of Lydia herself, her eyes crossed out with thick black ink. Nate's heart pounded as he flipped through the pictures. Some of the faces were accompanied by notes scrawled in shaky handwriting, phrases like, "doesn't notice," "too busy to care," and "knows something." The last photo in the stack was the most chilling. a close-up of Lydia's house taken at night with a shadowy figure standing in the front yard. It wasn't Lydia. It was someone or something else entirely. Suddenly, a sound behind him made Nate jump. A soft rustling like fabric brushing against glass. He turned sharply, but the greenhouse was empty. The only sound now was the pounding of his own heart. He quickly closed the chest and backed out of the greenhouse, his mind racing. Who had been watching Lydia? And why were they collecting these photos? As he returned to his truck, Nate noticed a figure standing at the far end of the street. It was a man dressed in a long coat, his face obscured by the brim of a hat. He stood perfectly still as if watching Nate. When Nate blinked, the man was gone. That night, Nate couldn't sleep. The events of the day felt like fragments of a puzzle he couldn't piece together. His thoughts kept returning to the photograph of the shadowy figure, to Lydia's frail body in the hospital bed, to the words scrawled on the photographs. Someone knew something about what had happened to Lydia. Someone had been watching her and possibly watching him. The next morning, Nate awoke to a pounding on his door. Disoriented, he stumbled to answer it, finding Detective Harper on his stoop, looking grave. "We need to talk," she said, pushing past him into the living room. Nate's heart sank. He hadn't told anyone about the greenhouse or the photographs, but the guilt weighed heavily. "What's this about?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Harper sat down, tossing a manila folder onto his coffee table. "You were close to Lydia Martin, weren't you?" "I delivered her mail," Nate replied cautiously. "She was nice, quiet." Harper's piercing gaze made it clear she wasn't buying his nonchalance. "Neighbors said they saw you at her house more than once. Lydia was reclusive, but for some reason she trusted you." "Why?" Nate hesitated, debating how much to reveal. "I don't know. Maybe because I listened when no one else did. She was lonely." Harper opened the folder, revealing grainy black and white surveillance photos. Nate leaned in and froze. The images showed him stepping into Lydia's garden the day before. One photo clearly captured him entering the greenhouse. "You're not in trouble yet," Harper said, her tone sharp. "But I need to know why you went back there." Nate began, but the words stuck in his throat. Finally, he admitted, "I saw footprints. They led me to the greenhouse. There was a chest inside full of photos. The people. Of Lydia." Harper's expression darkened. "What kind of photos?" "Old ones. People in the neighborhood. Their faces were scratched out. And there was one." Nate hesitated, but the memory clawed its way out. It showed someone standing in her yard. "At night." Harper leaned forward. "Did you take anything from the chest?" Nate shook his head. "No, but something felt like I wasn't alone." The detective's lips pressed into a thin line. "We searched the greenhouse yesterday. There was no chest." Nate's stomach churned. "That's impossible." "I saw it." Harper stood abruptly. "If there was a chest, someone moved it. And if someone's collecting those photos, they're dangerous." She turned to leave but paused at the door. "Stay out of it, Nate. This isn't your problem to solve." But it felt like his problem now. That night, Nate couldn't shake the unease. He double-checked the locks on his doors and windows, yet still felt exposed. Around midnight, a soft thud echoed from his backyard. He grabbed a flashlight and cautiously stepped outside. The yard was empty, but the beam of his flashlight caught something resting on the ground. A single envelope, pristine and addressed to him. His name was written in the same shaky handwriting he'd seen on the photographs. With trembling hands, he opened it. Inside was a single photograph. It showed him standing in the greenhouse, staring into the chest. But in the background, barely visible in the shadows, was a figure watching him. His breath hitched. The figure wore a long coat and a hat, the same man he'd seen at the end of Pinewood Drive. Before he could process what he was seeing, the sound of glass shattering rang out from inside the house. Nate spun around, his flashlight trembling as he hurried back inside. The living room was in disarray. Furniture overturned, books scattered across the floor. But what froze him in place was the mirror above the fireplace. It was shattered, the shards reflecting the dim light in jagged angles. Scrawled across the cracked surface in the same black ink from Lydia's photograph was a single word: leave. Nate didn't sleep that night. By morning he'd packed a bag and driven as far as he could, leaving Pinewood Drive, and its dark secrets, behind. Months later, a new mailman took over Nate's route. On his first day he noticed the overgrown garden at Lydia's old house. Curious, he wandered to the backyard and found the greenhouse door ajar. Inside he discovered a wooden chest, its lid slightly open. He peeked inside and screamed,